My camera makes me still talk.
How's everyone tonight? Good crowd? Thanks for coming, everyone. My name is John Moss. I am a volunteer with the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, and this is our opening event for our symposium on the Revolutionary War. So welcome here. I want to thank, first of all, the Barnes of Rose Hill folks here who have put this on and worked with us, and it was an easy thing to do. Everyone very cooperative, so I really want to make sure that Nathan in particular and others who have worked with us to set this up. We'd like to have a Friday evening, a different venue besides our symposium, which will be at the Doubletree Hotel tomorrow, all day till 4 o'clock. So we're going to start out here with just a welcome to everyone. Again, thanks to everyone for coming. And I want to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Dr. Kevin Weddle, retired colonel, U.S. Army. He was a distinguished fellow at the U.S. Army War College. He previously served as professor of military theory and strategy and as the Elihu Root Chair of Military Studies. His most recent book is The Complete Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution, which to say is award-winning is an understatement. It's won 6 national and international literary awards, including the Gilder Lehrman Prize in Military History and the Society of the Cincinnati Prize. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome tonight Dr. Kevin Weddle.
Well, thank you, John. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Great. Thanks, John. That was a very nice introduction. I really appreciate that. And thank you all for coming out. I'm glad the weather cleared up. And we have a nice day today, and what a beautiful venue for this. So anyway, it's a huge honor and a privilege for me to be here today. So let me jump right in. So I don't have to tell this audience that Saratoga was really important. And of course, it was one of the most pivotal campaigns in American history. The campaign included 10 battles and engagements. It lasted over 5 months. It was complex, it was fluid, it was multidimensional. It was shaped by countless interactions and contingencies. It played out over hundreds and hundreds of square miles. And the personalities involved were as interesting as any you're ever going to come across. But more important than all that, of course, is that it changed the very character of the American Revolution. So now in a campaign with so many moving parts and contingencies around every corner, there are many reasons why it turned out the way it did. But in my book, I argue that if you boil it all down, there are really 2 major reasons why the British lost this campaign in such a spectacular fashion. And that is faulty British military strategy and superior American leadership. Now, in the short time we have today, I'm going to discuss those 2 topics. I'm going to examine the military strategy and then look at the leadership qualities and deficiencies of some of the key protagonists on both sides. Now, with so many characters involved, I'm just going to be kind of flying along at wave top level. And so I'm sure I'm going to leave out many of your favorites. But maybe we can address some of that in the Q&A if I miss somebody. So what I want to do is start off by doing a lightning fast, quick review of the campaign that is undoubtedly very familiar to this audience. So in late August 1777, Britain's King George III received momentous news, and the great tidings so thrilled the monarch of Great Britain that he burst into his wife's chamber, very unseemly, and he waved the message in the air and he exclaimed, "I have beat them, I have beat the Americans." Now what had happened is he had just received news that Lieutenant General John Burgoyne and his army had captured the strategically vital fortress of Fort Ticonderoga, which sat astride the great Lake Champlain, Lake George, Hudson River Valley invasion route from Canada. Now this victory, achieved with almost no casualties, convinced the king and his ministers that the strategy that they had put into place the preceding spring was going exactly according to plan, and that the revolution was on its last legs. But less than 2 months after the king's impromptu celebration, Burgoyne and his army had met with an unprecedented disaster and the British were subsequently faced with a very, very different war. Now, the foundations of this campaign were laid about 8 months before the king received that message, but more on that later. What I'm going to do first is quickly review the actual conduct of the campaign. Okay, so in a 5-month campaign with so many moving parts, this is just a summary, but Lieutenant General John Burgoyne and about his 10,000-man army composed of British and German regulars, Canadians, and Native American allies departed from Canada on the 14th of June, 1777. They traveled south on Lake Champlain, and they arrived at Fort Ticonderoga on the 2nd of July. And their goal was to get to Albany. Burgoyne captured Ticonderoga with unexpected ease on the 6th of July, 1777. A supporting force of about 1,800 men under Brigadier General Barry St. Leger left on the 23rd of June from Canada, and they arrived at the Mohawk River on the 2nd of August. And their goal was to meet Burgoyne at Albany, coming down the Mohawk River. General Sir William Howe, the British commander-in-chief, loaded his army on transports in New York Harbor and set sail on the 23rd of July for Philadelphia. And they landed at the head of the Chesapeake Bay, south of Philadelphia, on the 25th of August. So that depicts them taking off by sea. The main American army in New Jersey was commanded, of course, by George Washington. And the American Northern Army and also the Northern Department were commanded by Major General Philip Schuyler. Now, while Burgoyne was doing his thing, St. Leger's supporting column unexpectedly ran into a plucky American garrison at Fort Stanwix, guarding the approaches to the Mohawk River. St. Leger tried and failed to take the fort after a 22-day siege, which I think is really one of the most fascinating aspects of the entire Saratoga campaign. It also included the horrific Battle of Oriskany, and he was ultimately forced to retreat back to Canada. So that column is off the board. Now we'll zero in on this area right here and kind of get a close-up of how the rest of the campaign played out. Okay, there you see, start up here, Lake George, Lake Champlain, the Hudson River Valley right here, and there's General Burgoyne and General Schuyler, the American commander. So, as already mentioned, Burgoyne captured Fort Ticonderoga almost without a fight on the 6th of July. The British garrison marched overland to the east, closely pursued by the British. The American rear guard was caught and engaged on the 7th of July at the small but very important Battle of Humberton. And a shout out to the world's expert on Humberton, Bruce Venter, right here. The Brits won, but they were forced to end their pursuit. Burgoyne also caught and scattered other escaping, retreating Americans at Skenesboro, which is present-day Whitehall, New York, right at the southern tip of Lake Champlain. After losing Ticonderoga, the American commander Schuyler concentrated the army at Fort Edward. Burgoyne then moved the bulk of his army to Skenesboro, where they stayed for 2 weeks, and then he moved to Fort Edward, where he stayed for another 2 weeks. You can see that right there. One thing about having an assignment at the Pentagon is you really figure out PowerPoint. Might be the only thing I really figured out in an assignment at the Pentagon. The American Northern Army, as you could see from my presentation there, withdrew in the face of Burgoyne's advance, but as they did, they obstructed the British route, slowing their rate of march. Now, Schuyler did a pretty good job delaying Burgoyne and kind of rebuilding the shattered American army up there after Ticonderoga, but there was very little indication of that in the messages, the very panicky and pessimistic messages he sent back to his subordinates. And I'm talking about George Washington, the commander-in-chief, and Congress. But by trading space for time, the Americans were able to regroup after the Ticonderoga disaster, as Burgoyne began to run into serious logistical issues because he had left Canada without sufficient logistical support, supplies, and transport primarily. And maybe we can talk about that during the Q&A. By the time Burgoyne arrived at Fort Miller, see him moving there to Fort Miller, he was in deep trouble logistically. You can also follow the timeline here as a little temperature gauge timeline there. He was really in deep trouble logistically, and he was forced to stay at Fort Miller for another 3 weeks, so it's a very slow advance. Now, by early August, Congress had lost confidence in Major General Schuyler, and they replaced him with Major General Horatio Gates. There's Gates right there. By mid-August, Burgoyne's logistical situation was extremely dire, so he sent a large detachment of German troops to seize food and transport known to be near Bennington, Vermont. And you can see them doing that right there. And they were intercepted and destroyed by an American force of mostly militia on the 16th of August. You see that, and of course, the famous Battle of Bennington. Now, Burgoyne was in deep, deep trouble. He had just lost 1,000 men, and almost all of his Native American allies deserted him after Bennington. They could read the writing on the wall. In the meantime, Gates moved the American army north. So now he has come in, he's taken over. He moves the American army north, and they dig in on favorable terrain at a place called Bemis Heights. And we'll see him do that here in just a second. There we go. Burgoyne decides to continue on to Albany. On the 13th of September, he will cross the Hudson River to the west bank and continue south. The two evenly matched armies finally fight a full-scale battle on the 19th of September, 1777, called the Battle of Freeman's Farm. Although the British suffered casualties that amounted to 3 times the American losses, the British held the ground, and thus they could claim a nominal victory. So now Burgoyne is faced with yet another big decision: push on to Albany, or do I fall back? As Burgoyne's army grew weaker due to sickness, battle casualties, and desertions, the American army grew stronger as hundreds and then thousands of militia forces will flock to Bemis Heights to join Gates and the American army. Hoping to receive support from Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton, coming up from New York City, Burgoyne then directed his army to prepare defensive positions and dig in. But the rescue never came from Clinton. The closest they get is about 60 miles away. The armies will fight one more time on the 7th of October, 1777, at the Battle of Bemis Heights, brought on by a desperate attempt by Burgoyne to forage for food and scout American positions, basically trying to scout American positions for a way around. In the end, this second bloody battle, the Americans were firmly positioned on Burgoyne's right flank, finally forcing him to pull out and retreat north. So Burgoyne's exhausted army will trudge north in a cold, driving rain, but their retreat will grind to a halt after only 8 miles at a place called Saratoga, with the Americans following closely behind. There at Saratoga, the heavily outnumbered British were soon surrounded, and it was quickly over. On the 17th of October, while an American band played Yankee Doodle, Burgoyne will surrender his army to Gates, as depicted in, of course, this famous Trumbull painting now hanging in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. Burgoyne had left Canada with over 10,000 men, and only 15 weeks after seizing the great fortress at Ticonderoga, he ended up surrendering almost 6,000 soldiers. So less than 4 months after Burgoyne's surrender, thanks to that stunning victory combined with Benjamin Franklin's brilliant diplomacy, the U.S. and France will sign a Treaty of Amity and Commerce and a Treaty of Alliance on the 6th of February, 1778. Although the war would go on for several more years, the final victory at Yorktown was won by a combined U.S.-French army with decisive support from a French fleet. So Saratoga was not sufficient for ultimate U.S. victory, but it was necessary, I would argue. There were many other near and long-term consequences, implications, but I'll leave it there for now. Okay, so now we have run through this very complex campaign at lightning speed. Hopefully, it's probably a review for most of you. So now I'd like to zero in on those 2 themes that really kind of form the bedrock of this presentation. And the first is military strategy. What is military strategy? It's how you use your very limited, doesn't matter how many military resources you never have enough, you never have what you want. How to use your limited military resources to achieve your political ends. So a good definition, a definition I always used at the War College was, military strategy is the calculated application of ways and means to achieve a political objective or a large military objective. Now that sounds really simple, but it's actually very, very difficult. If it was easy, we'd be a lot better at it, and we're not good at it at all. I would argue we haven't been good at it since World War II, but that's a different story. So one of the most fascinating, confusing, and I think misunderstood things about the Saratoga campaign is how the British developed and executed their military strategy for 1777. So we have to go back to a period well before this campaign kicks off. So, and that is the end of 1776 and early 1777. So what was the strategic situation? Of course, the British occupy New York City. They've kicked Washington out of there. Washington and his army barely escaped destruction, as we all know. It seemed to many that the revolution was on its last legs, but Washington, of course, stops the bleeding with his stunning twin victories at Trenton and Princeton in late 76 and early 77. So now the British are faced with a problem. After Trenton and Princeton, they realized that a new strategy was needed, and so they had to plan military operation. What are they going to do for 1777? And frankly, they were getting a little sick of this thing, and they wanted to end it, and especially the king was very, very anxious to finish this thing up. Okay, so these are the architects of British military strategy in 1777. There are others involved, but these are the main players, these four folks. And I'll start from the top and I'll kind of go clockwise here. Of course, King George III, he was heavily involved in strategy development and personnel decisions. Yes, he was a constitutional monarch, but you know, they're still in that kind of transition. He still has a lot of power and influence, so he has got his fingers in this. On the right there is General Sir William Howe. He's the commander-in-chief, the British commander-in-chief in North America with his headquarters in New York City. At the bottom there is Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. He had been the second in command in Canada in the 1776 campaign, but now he's back in London. So he's the one who kind of brought the news of Valcour Island and all that, brought it back to London. So he's back in London in December of 76 into January 77. And then the man on the left there is Lord George Germain. He's a former general, and he's now the Secretary of State for the colonies. So he's the civilian minister responsible for managing the war in North America. Now, in early 1777, actually late 1776, early 1777, both Burgoyne and Howe are going to offer up competing plans for ending the rebellion. They're very different plans, as you'll see in a minute. And it was ultimately up to Germain, with input from the king, to reconcile these plans and issue guidance that would give the British military the best chance for success. So first of all, let's start with John Burgoyne. Start with his plan. Because Burgoyne was in London, he's able to press his case directly to the king and Lord Germain in January and February of 1777. Remember, this is almost 7 months. It is 7 months before Burgoyne captured Fort Ticonderoga. So this is his plan. So 3 conversion columns using Lake Champlain and Lake George and the Hudson River Valley as invasion routes from the main body coming down from Canada. Seize Fort Ticonderoga, gain loyalist support, reach Albany by the early fall. Okay. Then another supporting force is going to go basically up the St. Lawrence into Lake Ontario and then down the Mohawk River Valley, also converging on Albany. So they're a supporting force, so hopefully draw off American forces to face them, make it a little bit easier for Burgoyne, but also clear out the Mohawk River Valley and link up there at Albany. And then his plan called for General Howe to come up the Hudson River and also link up with these other 2 columns at Albany. And from there, they would control the Hudson River Valley and then conduct some further unspecified military operations into New England. The whole idea, of course, was to split what they thought were the more rebellious New England colonies away from what they thought were the less rebellious middle colonies and southern colonies. Basically divide and conquer. Now on paper, it's an imaginative but very complex plan, as I think you can see. In reality, I think it'd be difficult to pull off today, let alone in the late 18th century because of distance, time, weather, logistical challenges over very, very tough, unforgiving wilderness terrain. But it was enthusiastically embraced by both Germain and the king. But Howe, the British commander-in-chief, had his own ideas on how to win the war in 1777. So this is going to be General Howe's plan. It's very, very different. By early 1777, especially after Trenton and Princeton, Howe, and remember, he's the British commander-in-chief, he has come to the conclusion that George Washington and his army are the centers of gravity of the American rebellion. So in other words, if you defeat Washington and his army, you're going to end the rebellion. So think of it kind of like the American Civil War. You know, the South was never going to go down the tubes until Lee and his army were destroyed. And that's kind of the way Howe looked at Washington and his army. So his plan called for taking Philadelphia, and in the process he hoped this would lure Washington into a battle from which he could destroy the main army and thus win the war. So Howe proposed moving by sea. I know most of you probably know that cooperation between the British Army and the British Navy really wasn't a problem during this stage of the war, because who was commanding the British Navy in American waters? Richard Howe, Lord Richard Howe, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, his brother. So they get along quite well, as it turns out. Didn't always happen, Navy and Army folks getting along well. But he proposes to move the army by sea, capture the rebel capital. George Washington would be forced to defend it, and he would have his decisive battle and destroy Washington's army. So these are the two competing plans, very, very different, as you can see. The huge challenge for the British decision makers in London was to either pick one of these two options and go with it, come up with something completely different, or somehow coordinate these two into one coherent military strategy. Now, there's a big problem with trying to coordinate military strategy that they faced in early 1777, and I call that the tyranny of distance and time. And what am I really talking about here? Well, you've got one major decision maker, arguably the most important of the decision makers. He's the commander-in-chief sitting there in New York City, and 3,500 miles away, you have three other major decision makers sitting in London. So how do you coordinate strategy when these key decision makers are 3,500 miles away, and an exchange of messages could take up to 3 months? So, answer to that, of course, as you all know, really hard. And that's exactly what happens. As you might imagine, the coordination for this was a nightmare, and it just did not work out well. And of course, the distances in North America itself were also pretty daunting. So for example, from the St. Lawrence River to the final Saratoga battlefields was around 200 miles. And it was around 300 miles from the battlefields from the Saratoga battlefields to Philadelphia, where the American commander-in-chief is. So that's a challenge as well. Of course, communications, you can only go as fast as a guy on a horse. So that's a real challenge. So what happens? Well, you know, these are the guys who have to really do the bulk of the coordination here. What ends up happening is the orders cross, as you might expect. And so it leads to misunderstanding, confusion. What happens is Germain and the king approve Burgoyne's plan, but they also approve Howe's plan. But they tell Howe, hey, once you finish taking Philadelphia, then go up and help Burgoyne. But by the time Howe gets that order, he's already at sea, and it's way too late to do much of anything by that time. It gets really confusing. In fact, I have an appendix in my book. It took me forever to do this, but I actually tracked all the letters and messages that went back and forth across the Atlantic, or as many as I could dig up. And finding out, you know, okay, it was sent here, it was received here, here's how they answered it, you know, that kind of thing. And you can just follow the breadcrumbs and you can see how it comes apart. It's just reading that appendix, you can kind of see how this whole strategy comes apart. So what ends up happening is there's no overall overarching military strategy. It's not obvious who's overall in charge. There's no clearly defined, decisive, or attainable objective. The closest to that, I think, is Howe's strategy. I think he had the right idea. You may disagree with me completely. I know a lot of historians disagree with me on that one. But I think he had the right idea. You got to go out, you got to somehow figure out a way to track Washington down and destroy him. That's going to be very hard, though, because Washington doesn't want to get himself trapped and destroyed. Unexamined assumptions. There are lots of unexamined assumptions throughout this whole thing, involving Native Americans, logistics, loyalist support, how long is it going to take to get to Albany, what happens once you get to Albany, all sorts of things. Nobody has really thought this through. But the biggest problem, I think, is instead of having one coherent military strategy, you end up with two utterly uncoordinated military strategies, which do what? It fritters away your combat power. And so you're not focusing on the decisive thing, whatever that is, whether it's splitting the colonies in half or going after Washington. So they didn't do that. And I argue in my book that almost everything that happens in this campaign will flow from this faulty strategy. Okay, so that's my first theme. Let's go on to the second one, and that is leadership. And I also throw in personalities with that. Now, the two themes, military strategy and leadership, are really closely linked, as you might expect. Now, any assessment of leadership is going to be pretty subjective in nature, so you may well disagree with my conclusions. That's fine. For our purposes today, there are two kinds of leadership: direct leadership and senior level or strategic leadership. So direct leadership is kind of what you would expect. Face-to-face interaction, influence with subordinates, direct control over your resources, your people, your equipment. Authority relationships are very clear. I'm a company commander. I'm responsible for these 100 guys. Pretty straightforward. Clear tasks. These tend to be very clear tasks of direct leadership. Take that hill. Move from point A to point B. Fix bayonets in charge. I mean, pretty straightforward direct leadership. Technical skills, you have to be really proficient at drill and tactics and logistics, all that stuff. It's more reactive based on training. You're not asked to think a whole lot. You're asked to follow orders and do your thing. And responsibility and authority are pretty limited. Now, frankly, the vast majority of leadership on both sides at the colonel level and below, direct leadership, I think is pretty good. Now again, you may disagree. I know there's a lot of scholars of Saratoga out there. You've done a lot of reading, but I think it's really pretty good on both sides. A lot of impressive leaders at the direct level. The major difference between these two sides' leadership, I would argue, in this campaign, are at the senior leader level, both in the military and civilian. Now, senior level leadership requires much different skills than those I just talked about, the direct leadership. And that's what I want to focus on for the remainder of our talk. So I'm mainly going to talk about these senior leaders. Now, of course, there's overlap. Senior leaders sometimes will have to do direct leadership. I mean, sometimes they'll have to say, follow me, men, we're going to attack that hill. Sometimes they have to step in and do that. But for the most part, their skills, a really good senior level leader is going to have different skills. And what are they? So what am I talking about when I'm talking about these other skills? Things like frame of reference development. So that's, usually that's defined as a complex knowledge structure built over time based on schooling, personal experience, and self-study. And that's, of course, a professional senior military officer would have all that. Problem management, often problems at the senior level, and I know there's probably many former executives in here or current executives, professionals in here, that you understand that at the senior level, there's very few right answers. It's often how you manage a problem instead of actually solving a problem. Envisioning the future. This is really important for a military officer, especially a senior military officer. How is my campaign, basically looking ahead and saying, how is my campaign going to play out? What decisions do I have to make that will have an impact 30 days from now? And how will all this play out based on what the enemy's doing, whatever. Systems understanding. An army is even a late 18th century army is a very complex system of a bunch of different components. And so a senior level leader has to understand those different components. Infantry, artillery, cavalry, there's really no cavalry involved in Saratoga campaign, but things like that, logistics, all that stuff. How does all that stuff fit together, and how do I employ those different systems so it all comes together and gives us the kind of the maximum effect. Senior leaders have to have a foot or at least a toe in the political realm. They have to understand where they sit with the political leaders. Both the Americans and the Brits had to worry about that. Consensus building. Often at the very senior level, you're building consensus instead of just issuing an order, especially for peers, and oftentimes with subordinates and superiors at the very high level. Communications, negotiation skills, all these are very, very important. So where the direct leader has really few opportunities for flexibility, imagination, demonstrating initiative, the senior level must have that in abundance. And a rigid senior leader will find it hard to react to things that do not go according to plan. But they have to have that ability based on years and decades of experience and sort of some innate qualities. So what I want to do is I want to look at 3 Brits and 3 Americans and kind of talk about what my leadership assessment of these guys are. So here are the key British players, just a few of the key British players. There are obviously many more. So starting at the top left, King, of course, we already talked about John Burgoyne, Sir William Howe. This is Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton. He is Howe's second in command at this point. General Sir Guy Carleton, he's the governor and commander-in-chief in Canada, the British governor and commander-in-chief. And of course, Lord George Germain. There are many others, Brigadier General Barry St. Leger, Brigadier General Simon Fraser, Major General William Phillips, Major General Friedrich Riedesel, the Mohawk chief, Joseph Brant, who was very influential in the whole siege of Fort Stanwix. But first I'm going to zero in on 2 of these guys, Germain and Burgoyne. So, Lord George Germain. So he was the Secretary of State for the colonies, and he was King George III's civilian minister with the primary responsibility for running the war in North America. So he's a former general officer. He was court-martialed for not following orders at the Battle of Minden in the 7 Years' War. And he was tossed out of the army and sentenced to never serve the crown in any manner again. He was rehabilitated, though, and his career was revived by King George III, and he assumed his current role in 1775. He's about 61 years old at this time. Extremely capable, he's a prodigiously hard worker, but as the civilian responsible for the war, he was in constant conflict with his senior army officers. Unfortunately for the British war effort, he never quite shook the shadow of Minden. He had this kind of do not suffer fools gladly sort of personality. He could be really, really difficult to get along with, so that led to some dysfunctional relationships amongst all these senior guys. While formulating military strategy in 1777, he was a micromanager while also not taking charge when he should have. I mean, most accounts of Saratoga, they say, oh, he was this micromanager. And he was to an extent, but he also, there were times when he should have stepped in and he doesn't. So in a way, he did and didn't micromanage the strategy, and this led to confusion. So again, he allowed Howe and Burgoyne to do what they wanted to do without proper coordination. He added unrealistic expectations that demonstrated a total lack of understanding of the challenges his leaders faced when campaigning in North America. So he really had no idea of how hard it was to move through the American wilderness, especially for Burgoyne. Not so much Howe down in the area around Philadelphia, New Jersey. That was maybe more like the plains of Europe, but up there in upstate New York, very, very different. None of these guys had any experience, or Germain, and he never really quite understood how difficult that was going to be. If he had, he might have asked some important questions when they were doing all this planning. And then, things like telling Howe, well, after you go to Philadelphia and defeat Washington, then go up to, just, not putting any thought into how long a campaign like that might take. So the Philadelphia and the Saratoga campaigns are very closely linked. And of course, they're going on simultaneously. And of course, what he should have done was pick one of those strategies and go with it, or somehow coordinate the two, which he didn't. Now, an associated thing is these poisonous relationships. Now, at the highest level of military command, personal relationships that develop and exist between leaders are absolutely critical. That means it's the same in the civilian world. Indeed, I would argue that sometimes they're even more important than the formal chain of command. And so exacerbating all the strategy issues that we just discussed was the relationships between these leaders that had to pull it off. And a good deal of that was due to Germain's inability to kind of build a team. So General Howe absolutely despised Germain, asked to be relieved in October of 1777. Almost all of these guys really did not like Germain at all. Carleton and Germain in particular detested each other. Germain thought that Carleton had not been sufficiently aggressive in 1776, and Carleton felt slighted and unappreciated by his civilian boss after he saved Canada and kicked the Americans out of Canada in 1776. And their correspondence in 1776 and 1777 are just filled with vitriol. They're actually very entertaining. But at the time, of course, you know, you got to put yourself back then. I mean, they're really nasty letters going back and forth. So that was a problem, of course, because Carleton was instrumental in trying to prepare Burgoyne for his operations. Clinton hated Howe. So, you know, Clinton and Howe, I mean, he's his second in command. They hate each other. They do not get along. And Howe had very little confidence. One of the senior British generals said that Howe had little confidence in Mr. Clinton. And Clinton was jealous of Burgoyne. Now, these guys are actually friends, Clinton and Burgoyne. But Clinton is senior to Burgoyne. He thought he should have had that command. So that's a problem. So not only did these men not get along with each other, but they had also lost confidence in their political leadership. Political leadership had lost confidence in them. And by late 1777, relationships within the British Army and between Germain, simply dysfunctional. It's hard to run a war when you have a situation like that. Now, that's not to say that the Americans didn't have their problems. They had plenty of problems. But they're able to work through them, work around them, ignore them sometimes. They're able to work through it. The Brits are not. So the British military strategy in 1777 was complicated enough with all the things we already talked about, but it was further hampered by these very fraught relationships. Okay, so let's talk about Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. Really interesting guy. He's about 55 years old. I love that painting of him. This Joshua Reynolds painting of him. It's actually in the Frick Gallery in New York City, so it's not in Britain, it's over here. It's just a magnificent painting of him, but it's painted about 11 years before Saratoga campaign kicks off. This is what he looked like. Most of you have probably never seen this one. But this is in the, I found it in the collections of the British National Army Museum. So it's in my book. So this was painted about 78, 79. So this is after he got back. So it's a contemporary painting around the time of the Saratoga campaign. But this is such a wonderful painting of the typical, you know, cavalryman. And in 30 years in the Army, I've known lots of cavalrymen, and they would have given their right arm to have a painting painted of them, looking exactly like that. So he's in command of that British Army coming down from Canada. He's a career British cavalry officer. He's very aggressive and flamboyant, like every cavalryman I've ever met in my life. I hope I'm not insulting any former cavalrymen out there, although most cavalrymen I know would say, damn right I am. He was also arrogant and pompous. I will not go on and say all of the cavalry officers I've ever known have been like that. He was also well liked by his troops, though. I mean, in that era of the professional British Army, that was unusual, that the troops really liked him, because he took care of them. He served in America early in the Revolution, but he didn't have much respect for Americans or American soldiers. And this was magnified after his easy capture of Fort Ticonderoga in July of 1777. He's a playwright and a member of Parliament, and he's a favorite of George III. And despite serving almost his entire adult life in the British Army, this is really his first independent command. So, but there's many problems with Burgoyne as this campaign begins. At one point, on the 5th of April, Howe will send him a letter after he gets approval to go after Philadelphia, and he sends this letter to Burgoyne, who ultimately will receive this letter once he's up in Canada, getting ready for his campaign. He says, "Oh, by the way, I'm not coming up the Hudson River, just so you know. I'm not coming up the Hudson. I'm going to Philadelphia. I got permission to go to Philadelphia, so you're on your own getting to Albany." And instead of kind of following up and going, "Wait, I thought you were supposed to come up to Albany," and he doesn't do anything. Burgoyne just blissfully continues ahead. He starts the campaign without adequate logistics, so there's that systems thinking issue. He fatally delays at Skeensboro, Fort Edward, and Fort Miller. He fails to accept sound advice from his subordinates, especially Brigadier General Simon Fraser, probably his best combat commander, and Major General Riedesel. He doesn't retreat after Bennington and Freeman's Farm, despite having complete information that things are kind of going south, and maybe you better concentrate on saving the Army. He demonstrates confirmation bias over and over and over again. Every bit of information he interprets as just, yes, I'll continue the course, continue the course, continue the course, even when it was obvious that things were not going well. He fails to use his initiative despite being told to use the initiative. Instead, he will say, I'm ordered to go to Albany, and that's what I'm going to do. And these orders offer no other option. Where Germain and Howe both told him, okay, you need to use your initiative at all times. And he fails to do that. He never steps back and kind of looks at the whole big picture. He shackles himself to a plan written 5 months before and 3,500 miles away. And but on the plus side, he's actually a good negotiator. And at the very end, the terms he's able to secure for the Army after the surrender is actually pretty impressive. He accepts absolutely no responsibility for anything, and he blames everyone. After the disaster, he blames Germain, he blames Howe, he blames his German troops, all quite ridiculous. Now, Norman Dixon wrote a classic book on the psychology of military incompetence. You guys just love that title. But he observed that a certain kind of officer has virtues that get them promoted. Taking orders, carrying them out, being really good at that, kind of that direct leadership stuff. But once in command, they are basically paralyzed when under stress and in a crisis. They don't listen to sound advice, nor do they consider contradictory information, confirmation bias that I just mentioned before. They're personally brave. Burgoyne was certainly personally brave, but they're inflexible when a situation requires imagination. And if they experience a disaster, they will blame everyone and everything but themselves. Now, I would argue that throughout all my study of all this stuff, and I'm mainly a Civil War historian and World War II historian, and looking at all that stuff, even a bad strategy can yield some positive outcomes if it's executed with vigor and imagination. But Burgoyne was not the man for the job, at least not this job. In my view, Burgoyne was a decent officer who simply found himself out of his depth in command of this highly challenging operation. And so when things started to go wrong, he reverted to that kind of officer that Norman Dixon described in his book. There's plenty of blame to go around for the overall British failure of this campaign, but to me, Burgoyne is responsible for the actual loss of the Army. All right, let's turn to the Americans. So here's, of course, a rogues gallery of the Americans. Some good and some bad up here. So clockwise from top left, of course, you have Major General Schuyler that we've already mentioned. We'll talk about him in depth. George Washington, of course, the Commander-in-Chief. Horatio Gates, who will replace Schuyler. Anybody know who this is?
Peter Gansevoort.
Yes, Peter Gansevoort. Peter Gansevoort is the commander, the 26-year-old full colonel commander of Fort Stanwix, and does a brilliant job commanding Fort Stanwix. Unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about him. Major General Arthur Sinclair, he commands the American commander at Ticonderoga. And, of course, Benedict Arnold there. There are many others, of course. I could talk about Major General Benjamin Lincoln, one of the most important figures in this whole campaign that no one's ever heard of. Brigadier General John Stark, of course, the famous victor of Bennington. Colonel Daniel Morgan, of course, here we are. We're talking just close to his house. I'm hardly going to mention him at all. Lieutenant Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko, the famous engineer, and as a former combat engineer, he's very close to my heart. And of course, Colonel James Wilkinson, that rogue. But I'm gonna first discuss the two American senior commanders who commanded the Northern Army. Now, Major General Philip Schuyler, he commanded the American Northern Department, which included Fort Ticonderoga and Fort Stanwix, and the Northern Army. He's a native New Yorker. He lived in the Albany, Saratoga area. He's this upper class patrician. He comes across as kind of haughty, kind of above the troops. He's not particularly well liked, especially by militia troops and especially by New Englanders. They do not like him or trust him at all. That will be a problem that he'll have to deal with. but he's a decent manager, and he understands logistics. So some of the kind of positives and negatives, pros and cons of Schuyler during this campaign. He's about 44 years old during this campaign. He basically abandons his post in the spring of 1777 to go to Philadelphia and complain to Congress that he's not being treated well. And so he kind of lets his command kind of twist in the wind without a commander. Gates will step in and kind of fill the void. He has a very poor relationship with New England units and the militia. He fails to properly supervise Fort Ticonderoga. He never develops a good rapport within the Army. Some good things he does, though. He does a pretty good job reconstituting the Army after the Fort Ticonderoga debacle. He's really good with applying his local knowledge. I mean, the guy's from this area. He understands the terrain, so there's that frame of reference development. He does a really good job obstructing Burgoyne's advance. And after he's relieved of his command, he could have gone home and pouted, but instead he stays on and he helps the Army after his relief by pushing logistics forward from Albany. So that's pretty selfless. In fact, he's there at the surrender. But his worst problem is communications. His unrelenting negative reports to Congress and George Washington that all was lost, that the Army was in a panic, and that he generally was failing to establish and maintain morale within the Army. Now, if you read those messages today, if you go into Washington's papers and you read the messages that Schuyler is sending to Washington and Congress, and disregarding what you already know, if I just went to you and said, read these, what would you think? You would come to the conclusion that it's entirely understandable that Washington and Congress had lost confidence in his ability to command the Northern Department. And so, of course, in early August, he was replaced by Gates. Gates doesn't actually arrive until later in August, but the decision is made to relieve him in early August. Now, writing to Robert Livingston just days after Schuyler's relief, the 20-year-old aide to George Washington, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, said this about his future father-in-law. He writes, "I'm afraid Gates is hardly the man." He didn't care for Gates. "I'm afraid Gates is hardly the man, but this appointment to this command could not be avoided." So he writes that he had always given Schuyler the benefit of the doubt, but that the constantly gloomy assessments of the Northern Department and the sorry states of the troops just did not ring true to him, especially the accounts of panic. "Even in the Revolution's darkest hours," Hamilton wrote, "I never saw anything like a general panic among the troops. They appeared at the worst of times as resolute and spirited as the best. Panic in the Army," Hamilton concluded, "is generally a reflection upon the leader." It's pretty impressive kind of assessment from a 20-year-old, I think. Kind of spot on, I would say. Okay, so here is the man who relieved him. Horatio Gates is about 50 years old here. Schuyler's replacement is commander of the American Northern Department. So Gates is a former British Army officer. He served in the French and Indian War in North America. After the war, he sold his commission and settled in the colonies. He quickly becomes Americanized. And so when the Revolution begins, he offers his services to the Continental Army, and he serves under Washington. He's a good manager. He understands logistics. He believes in defensive warfare. He also understood how best to employ American militia forces, which was unusual. And he also liked Americans. He liked American militia. He liked working with them. That's very unusual for a former British Army officer. He desperately wants an independent command. And although Washington and Gates had enjoyed a good relationship early in the war, it had deteriorated by 1777. Now, Gates's reputation has suffered because of his post-Saratoga experience. Involvement in the so-called Conway Cabal, but especially the disastrous Battle of Camden, which he lost in spectacular fashion, as I'm sure all you know, in August of 1780. And I think that too many historians have allowed their assessment of Gates to be colored by what happens later. Now, I've been accused in reviews, especially in Amazon reviews, of being pro-Gates, a Gates apologist, and indeed a Gates lover. Now, I have no idea how you could read my book and come to that conclusion, but there you go. I'm frankly pretty critical of Gates's leadership on numerous accounts. His failure to closely supervise Fort Ticonderoga in the spring of '77, after he was ordered by Congress to go up there, and command the fort. Instead, he took de facto command of the department in the absence of Schuyler. He was at least as responsible as Schuyler, I think, for the loss of Ticonderoga. He pulls a ridiculous hissy fit before Congress when he was replaced by Schuyler in June of 1777. He fails to keep George Washington, his boss, informed. He barely conceals disrespect to Washington throughout his time as commander of the Northern Department. He allowed himself to be baited into his famous quarrel with his second-in-command, Benedict Arnold, after the Battle of Freeman's Farm. His involvement, of course, in the post-Saratoga Conway cabal. None of these are good things, and indeed many argue that the great Saratoga victory was won despite Gates, not because of Gates. No less than the great Nathaniel Greene, for one, observed that after Saratoga that this gentleman, talking about Gates, is the mere child of fortune. The foundation of all the Northern successes was laid long before his arrival there. So I would say Gates is right, or excuse me, Greene was right in a way, but only in part. Gates did inherit an army that had nowhere to go but up, and one that Schuyler had gotten back on track, and Burgoyne's army was significantly weakened by the time that Gates took over. But when he took over from Schuyler, the outcome of the campaign was hardly a done deal. Luckily for the American cause, I think Gates was just a good fit for that time and place. Why do I say that? Because he handled militia really well, and the militia was flocking to the army, largely because Gates had now taken command from Schuyler. They did not flock to the army when Schuyler was in command. They did when they heard that Gates was in command, especially New Englanders. He was steady, he was a good manager, he understood terrain. His defensive mindset, I think, was just what was needed in that operational situation. He didn't allow the mercurial Arnold, who they got along great before the Saratoga campaign, to goad him into out-of-character decisions. He was a good problem manager. He was a good systems thinker. He understood the importance of logistics. He understood the use of things like Morgan's riflemen, the use of militia. He ensured that there was no way Burgoyne was going to get past him because of his defensive positions on Bemis Heights, and that was going to be his primary focus. That's why only portions of the American army will actually go out and fight these battles, because he's so concerned about holding on to that key terrain. He was a decent battle manager, if not a great combat leader, which is, of course, what Arnold was. And I think in this situation, that's what was needed. If you needed a more dynamic and aggressive leader, Gates was not your guy. So I argue, actually, that his skill set fit perfectly into what was needed at this specific time and place. So during the Saratoga campaign from late August onwards, to paraphrase Liam Neeson in the movie Taken, you all seen that movie? Okay? I would say that Gates had a very particular set of skills. Skills he had acquired over a very long career, skills that made him a formidable foe for Burgoyne in September and October of 1777. Okay, I promised you 3 on either side. I'm going to finish up by talking about these two fellows, Washington and Howe, a tale of 2 commanders-in-chief. You're probably asking, what? Yeah, I mean, these guys are 300 miles away. Why are we even talking about them? Well, I think they were very important, because here you have the 2 opposing commanders-in-chief. Both were dual-hatted as commander-in-chief and as army commanders. Pretty unusual, actually. But in my view, their respective performances were quite different. By the way, Washington is 45 at the time, and Howe is 48, so relatively young men. Washington had a strategic sense that was lost on the British commanders. In other words, he saw the entire theater of operations as a whole, and Washington did not. Washington knew that operations in the North would affect his and vice versa, and as commander-in-chief, he had to coordinate the overall strategy, not just with his army, but what was going on in the Northern Department, and there are several other departments as well that he had to worry about. And this is something Howe did not do. He acted as an army commander, but not as a commander-in-chief. So throughout all that, even though in the summer of 1777, if you know your Philadelphia campaign, most of his attention is focusing on what is Howe doing, where is he going, once he loads up on the ship, where is he going? Is he going to Rhode Island? Is he going to Charleston? Is he going up the Hudson? Where is he going? Is he going to Philadelphia? But through all that, he also kept his eye on what was going on 300 miles to the north. And after the stunning loss of Fort Ticonderoga, He supported the panicking Major General Schuyler with wise counsel, advice, support, and with reinforcements that Schuyler desperately needed. But the most important thing Washington provided was sending experienced leaders to, frankly, put some steel in Schuyler's backbone. So who am I talking about? He sends Major General Benedict Arnold up there, arguably the most aggressive combat commander in the American Army. He sends Major General Benjamin Lincoln up there. Again, a guy most Americans have never heard of, very important guy. He had great influence on the Massachusetts militia. He worked with militia very well, so he's sent up there. He sends other GOs up there. He sends his most elite force, Colonel Daniel Morgan and his 500 riflemen from the main army. And of course, Daniel Morgan, think of him as like the 18th century Delta Force. This is a unit that everybody wants, but there's only one of them. And so Washington selflessly sends Morgan up there away from the main army when he could have used Morgan during the Philadelphia campaign. He also sends other reinforcements up there. Washington also, during this entire period, he's very politically astute in how he's working with Congress and how he's working with these other commanders. When Gates is sent up to command in the Northern Department, Washington realizes that Gates might be a problem politically. In other words, kind of going behind his back to Congress and so forth, and kind of going around the chain of command. So he asked Congress to make sure that everybody understood that he was the commander-in-chief for the entire military, not just the Army. And he actually gets Congress to pass a resolution in late August that was clearly aimed at Gates. Hey, by the way, don't forget, this guy is your boss. So really politically astute. And when I say political, I'm not talking about partisan political, I'm talking about small p politics. He successfully diffuses the so-called Conway cabal. He has a vision of how he wants things to play out. It doesn't always work, but he really has a good vision, I think. Team building, problem solving, systems management, political and social competence. He demonstrates this throughout. Now, his performance is not flawless by any means in 1777, as far as the Saratoga campaign goes. Indeed, I'm pretty critical of him, especially during the spring of 1777, for not paying enough attention to the Northern Department. But his performance is in stark contrast to Howe. Even though I'm pretty positive about Howe in my book, mainly because I think he had the right idea for winning the war. Destroy Washington, destroy the army, and then you destroy the rebellion. But he acted as an army commander and not as a commander-in-chief. So basically, Burgoyne was kind of let out to dry because Howe is not looking at the big picture. Even though once Howe moves south of Canada, once Burgoyne comes south of Canada into New York, technically he's under Howe's command. But Howe kind of gives him the Heisman, gives him the stiff arm. So in the Saratoga campaign, leadership and strategy are inextricably linked. The British were hamstrung from the beginning by a fatally flawed military strategy that was aggravated by leadership and personality issues. The Americans countered them with better leadership when it mattered, especially at the senior level. And mainly we're talking about Gates and Washington, but even Schuyler, especially toward the end, does a pretty good job. The Americans had issues of their own, to be sure. I talked about some of them, there are others, but in the end, they're able to overcome them and work through them. And they were thus able to achieve what one American general called the complete victory. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions. Sorry, I went a bit longer than I had anticipated. Sir?
I would like you to address maybe this is opinion, address the attitude that the British had towards Americans as far as their arrogance about their ability to just destroy them.
Yeah. So the question is about the British and their assessment of Americans and how good they were, and were they worthy foes, I suppose you'd say. Yeah. Well, most of them, and again, I'm primarily a Civil War historian. I'm not the greatest expert on the entire American Revolution. But from what I've, from my research, it strikes me that they were pretty dismissive of American abilities until they got their noses bloody. And in fact, you see throughout Burgoyne's correspondence, he's very dismissive of the Americans. He issues these very bombastic proclamations as he's working his way down from Canada. And Ticonderoga, the quick fall of Ticonderoga, I think just kind of builds on that. Once he fights the Americans at the Battle of Freeman's Farm, he changes his tune. And in fact, after he goes back to Britain, and of course he's blamed for the great defeat, and he's called in front of Parliament for inquiries on the defeat. He can say nothing but great things about the Americans. These guys are great. I know we didn't think so, but these guys are studs, and we need to watch out. It's going to take forever to beat these guys. And you see how, by around the time that he asks to be relieved in October of 1777, this is of course after he's taken Philadelphia, after he's won the Battle of Brandywine and Germantown. He also is sending back different sorts of assessments of the Americans. And in fact, he tells Germain, this is going to be a long war unless you give us a major influx of troops. Like about another 30,000 troops, which would pretty much double what they had. And I think, had they done that, maybe they could have tracked down Washington. But he was saying this is going to take a long time, especially since we've kind of figured out that Washington is not going to let himself get involved in a major decisive battle. So we're going to have to basically chase him to ground. So he's I think by that time they're figuring out that it's going to be a tough war. See, sir, I saw you next.
Could you talk a little bit about what I think is a sort of surreal disconnect between Burgoyne and Howe, where throughout this campaign, Burgoyne seems to be of the opinion that Howe is coming to meet him in Albany while Howe is on his way to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
I've never understood how this continues to go on and on when they're in different worlds.
This is really an interesting point. I'm glad you brought that up. Burgoyne actually, until he gets to Bennington, and until the Battle of Bennington, he never gets to Bennington, but he's at Fort Miller at the time. But until that happens, he is showing absolutely no concern about getting to Albany. None. He is absolutely confident that it's not going to be a problem. In fact, he leaves, this kind of goes back to those unexamined assumptions I talked about, the strategy at the very beginning. He leaves Canada without enough logistics support and transport. And he knows he doesn't have enough. But he thinks it's not going to be a problem because upstate New York is teeming with loyalists. And they're going to come out of the woodwork and they're going to give us transport, they're going to give us logistics support. Not going to be a problem at all. So he is absolutely unconcerned. And in fact, after the Saratoga campaign, he goes home. He has the parliamentary inquiry. He publishes a booklet, and you can get that online. You can get a reproduction of that online for a couple hours. Really interesting. He puts it together, all the correspondence and all that. He selectively leaves out a lot of stuff, and a lot of stuff that shows that he had absolutely no concerns about getting to Albany. After Bennington, then he has a concern. Then you see him start. It almost looks like he's laying the foundation for his excuses at that point. Oh my God, I just found out that Howe's not coming. Well, he knew Howe wasn't coming way back in the spring when Howe told him I'm not coming. If he was so concerned, why didn't he write Howe a letter saying, wait a minute, I thought you were supposed to be coming up the Hudson. Did I miss something? And he doesn't. It's because he's not concerned about getting to Albany at all. So that is a lot of post facto kind of stuff. He's covering his butt. And it's, it's really interesting to kind of see those letters, and you see that he is absolutely unconcerned about getting to Albany for the longest part of this campaign. Sir?
Why is Albany so important? And the second question I have is, we're trying now, there's Friends of Fishkill, which is in New York. It was a supply effort, and the people there are trying to, developers trying to pave it over, and they're trying to buy the property. So people are interested, they may want to go online, called Friends of Fishkill.
Oh.
But I don't know, were they involved in providing any supplies to the Patriots?
To the Patriots, sure. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about that, but I know there was supply, you know, there was American garrisons there. But I'm sorry, your question.
Why was Albany so important?
Oh yeah, well, I'm sorry, yeah, why was Albany? So Albany, of course, was not the capital at the time. Capital was Kingston, present-day Kingston. That's what this is also called. They burned that, by the way. Clinton, when he sends his rescue attempt, that never gets very close to Burgoyne, but they burned the city or the town. Albany is not, but Albany is centrally located. So when you saw where those three, columns converged, they're centrally located. So they thought that would be a good jumping-off point for the rest of the operations that they needed to conduct. So again, that was one of the problems with this strategy. For Howe, he actually had an objective. I want to go destroy Washington and his army. That's a good objective. Now you can argue whether it was possible to do, whether he had the combat power to do it, whether Washington was going to let himself get sucked into a battle like that or not. That's a great discussion to have. But Burgoyne's, basically, his strategy was based on geography. We're all going to get to Albany, then we're going to do stuff. I mean, really, when you read, he writes this pamphlet that really is what convinces, not pamphlet, but it's a long document. It's called Thoughts for Conducting the Army from the Side of Canada or something like that. It's a very elaborate 18th century title. But in that, it's a hand wave. Once we all come together at Albany, good things will happen. Well, that's no strategy. I mean, that's no, what is the objective? What are you trying to accomplish? If it's just getting to Albany, okay, but do you really think you can control the entire Hudson River Valley? Do you think you have enough combat power to control the Hudson River Valley? I would argue you don't. That's one of the things, I've had this argument with historians. They say that, oh, well, of course, if Howe would have gone up the river, this could have ended the war. I'm not sure it could have. They're talking about controlling the entire Hudson River. It's 200 miles. How do you control that with, how many, let's see, I figured it out once. Shows you what kind of boring life I have. Yeah, I figured out, even if you put all your troops, so Burgoyne's and Howe's army along there, it'd be about 133 soldiers a mile. How are you going to control, you're not going to be able to control that. So I think the whole idea of controlling the Hudson River, splitting New England from the rest of the colonies, and then going to conquer New England, it was all a pipe dream. They did not have the combat power. And in fact, again, this brilliant young aide of George Washington. Oh. Wow. We're good, aren't we? I guess I think it was. John, did you pay the rent for the whole? So, as long as you don't panic, I'll continue. So I really think it was not a viable strategy to begin with. And we talk about the brilliance of Alexander Hamilton. Here's another good example, I think, decent example, is in April, May of 1777. This is before any of this even happened. The Americans were American governors up in New England. They were very concerned that something like that might happen. That the Brits might try to do something like that, control the Hudson River Valley and all that. And Hamilton writes this wonderful letter, very strategically perceptive, I think. And of course, I think he was Washington's aide at the time. I think he was reflecting Washington's thoughts, but also in his own inimitable way. He's writing to these guys and he's saying, I know everybody's worried about that. You don't need to worry about it. they do not have enough troops to be able to control the Hudson River Valley. So yeah, it's going to cause some consternation. We're going to have some problems. It's going to give us some fits, but it's not going to end. It's not going to win the war for sure, and it's not going to be that much of a problem. So he was right. I think he was absolutely spot on. This is before it even happened. So Hamilton's a really interesting guy. I thought for a while to write an article about Hamilton the strategist, and I think he's a pretty sharp fellow. Yes, sir.
Well, speaking of interesting people, can you tell us about the conflict between Gates and Benedict Arnold?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Of course, you all know about that, I'm sure. Now, you got to remember, Gates and Arnold are really close. They work very closely together, especially in 1776. They worked very closely together. There's people who are out for Arnold's neck, and Gates protects him, basically, with Congress. He writes this great, in fact, I use it in one of the captions of one of the pictures in my book, where Gates writes this wonderful comment about when people are criticizing Arnold. This is in 1776. People with little virtues will always criticize somebody who has a lot, or something like that. And so he's basically saying these guys are all just jealous of Arnold. When Arnold hears that Gates is now in command, he writes him this wonderful letter saying, "Oh God, I'm so glad you're in charge now." So they get along really well. So after Freeman's Farm, now before Freeman's Farm, Arnold is trying to kind of prod Gates to go out and attack Burgoyne as he moves to the West Bank and starts heading south. Gates is adamant, nope, we're going to fight a defensive battle here at Bemis Heights. They fight the Battle of Freeman's Farm. Gates writes a report back to Congress where he doesn't really give a whole lot of credit to Arnold's troops, because it was Arnold's troops that fight the Battle of Freeman's Farm. And in fact, the only people he names by name are officers who were killed. So, but he says, troops fought well, da-da-da-da-da. So Arnold is upset that he doesn't think his guys have gotten enough credit. And number two, he's really upset that Gates isn't being aggressive. Okay, now we just fought this battle, we gave him this big bloody nose, let's finish it up. And Gates is going, nope, all these militia are coming in, pretty soon we're gonna outnumber these guys by a lot, we're gonna fight this defensive battle, no sense, spilling lots of blood. So they get into a big fight over those two issues. And in fact, there's the eyewitness accounts saying they're screaming at each other in the tent, screaming obscenities at each other. Gates was known to be very foul-mouthed, and he was practicing his skills there on Arnold. Arnold was giving it back to him, and after their initial verbal blowout, they repaired to each other's tents, half a mile apart, and proceed to send letters back and forth. And again, just like the letters between Carleton and Germain, they're very entertaining, reading these things. I mean, it gets down to the point where, your mother wears army boots. No, my dad could beat your dad. I mean, it got that's silly, back and forth. But finally, around the 3rd of October, those letters stop. And by the 7th of October, they are back on at least speaking terms. And we have eyewitness accounts of them being back on speaking terms. So yes, they have this big blowout. It lasts a long time. It's very juvenile. And it's thought, there's been a lot of accounts of Saratoga that said that Gates relieved him of command. He never is relieved of command. He's still in command of the the left wing of the army by the time the Battle of Bemis Heights takes over, or happens. And Gates is not cowering in his tent during the Battle of Bemis Heights. He was actually at the front directing operations, directing Arnold. Arnold's out there actually running the fight, but Gates is managing it from Bemis Heights. So and I think it reflects better credit on the two men than has previously been thought. I think they kind of became a little bit more mature just before the battle, and that of course is good for the American cause. So a little bit less dramatic than kind of the standard account, but no less important, I think. So yes, I mean they have a hissy fit. It's not good. It doesn't reflect credit on either one of those two guys. Yeah, but it's a fascinating thing for sure. I guess John's giving me the hook. We've got. I apologize. There's so many folks wanting to ask questions. Sir, see you back there.
This will be fast.
The last
Wonderful
one.
presentation. Thank you. I just want to point out, you mentioned Daniel Morgan living nearby.
Yeah.
We also have in adjacent Jefferson County, Horatio Gates living near Carnesville and Charles Lee. So
Right.
A lot of local
Yeah, absolutely.
connection.
Absolutely good stuff. Okay, we probably have time for one more. Sorry.
After the battle, what happened to the surrendered army?
Yeah, thank you. So this was, it's kind of a tragedy in a way. And so when I said that Burgoyne, he was a much better negotiator than he was combat commander. So he's able to negotiate mainly because negotiate a really favorable settlement with Horatio Gates called the Convention of Saratoga. Not a surrender document, but called the Convention, so they thought they could save face a little bit by not calling it a surrender. But basically it was a surrender. But basically what he said, what he was able to negotiate with Gates is that the British Army would be allowed to go home as long as they promised to never fight in North America again. So basically kind of give them their parole. And of course, troops are fungible, right? So all that would mean is now you free up 6,000 troops in Great Britain to come here. So you're not, the Brits aren't losing anything by this. They're not losing an army. And so when Washington and Congress get the details of this convention, they are not happy. They're happy about the great victory, but they're not happy about the terms of that convention. And so what Washington tells Major General Heath, who is up in Boston, so he's the guy who's going to, they basically marched the army from Albany to Boston, the captured army. They marched them to Boston. From there, they're supposed to get on ships and go back to Britain. But Washington sends a note to General Heath up here, and he says, look, you go through that convention with a fine-tooth comb, and if they haven't followed every single, cross the T, dotted the I point on that convention, they're not going anywhere. And so, in fact, he did, and they found out that one of the things was they were supposed to turn over all colors, all regimental colors. Well, it turns out that several of these units said, we're not giving our colors up, and they hid their colors, and they never gave them back. So they said, okay, you guys aren't going home. And so they used a couple other excuses for that. The British accused us of not following, the convention. But basically, we said, you're not going home because you didn't follow the convention. And then what happens is that army is then marched, the captured army is marched from Boston down to Charlottesville, Virginia, ultimately back up toward Lancaster. This is over the course of the war, because we were always trying to keep them away from any British troops, because we were afraid that the Brits were going to try to rescue these guys. So it's kind of a sad story, because many of these guys died of disease and so forth. Many of them deserted and became Americans. Many of them, after we said you can go home, they said, no, I think I like it here. And they stayed. A lot of the Germans. We also exchanged some of the senior officers. General Riedesel was exchanged. General Phillips was exchanged ultimately. Yeah, but it's still kind of a sad thing. And sometimes I remember when I was a cadet at West Point, I was driving home to Minnesota or driving back, I don't remember. And I saw, these roadside markers, the Convention Army marched through here. Who are those guys? Finally I found out. So every now and then you'll see that, the Convention Army, and that's the roadside marker, and that's these guys. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks to Kevin for a great presentation. Again, thanks to our hosts tonight, and thanks for everybody who's turned out tonight to hear a great program. And for those of you at the symposium conference tomorrow, we'll see you there. And I hope everyone has a good evening.
Thank you.